Miraculously, the hand of Simon de Montfort that's wrapped in cloth raises itself high above the head of the congregation. I imagine it sort of floating in the air above the head of the congregation. And everyone is amazed by this miracle.
Welcome to the History Extra Podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. The 13th century nobleman Simon de Montfort has gone down in history for two main reasons. Number one, that he was the first leader of a political movement in English history that sought to overthrow the monarchy, in his case King Henry III, in favour of a different system. And two, that his body was horribly dismembered after his defeat at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Today, we're going to focus on the second of those 2 points. Not only were de Montfort's head and testicles sent to the wife of one of his killers, but his butchered hands and feet were also spread far and wide across Britain. Historian Sophie Thérèse Ambler explains to David Musgrove why de Montfort met such a grisly end, and what it tells us about the politics of medieval England and Britain.
Today we are talking about medieval mutilation and macabre acts. I'm with Dr. Sophie Ambler from Lancaster University, and we are discussing what happened to the body of Simon de Montfort after his defeat at the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. So this podcast will have some gruesome elements to it, be warned. Sophie, in brief, what happened to Simon de Montfort's body after the Battle of Evesham?
Well, his body was seized upon by the death squad of men who were responsible for killing him. So this was barons of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, and they set about dismembering his body. So they cut off his head and his testicles, and by one account stuffed the testicles into his mouth, by another draped them over his nose. And the head and testicles were sent back as a present to the wife of the man who killed him. So this is Maud Mortimer, wife of Roger Mortimer, who dealt the lethal blow. At the same time, Simon's hands and feet were cut off, and these two were sent as trophies. So one hand was sent back to another wife of one of the men in this death squad. One of the feet was sent to the Prince of Wales, Llewellyn ap Griffith, who was an ally of Simon de Montfort, as a mark of enmity, and another foot was taken by one of Simon's men. It was rescued from the battlefield as a mark of veneration, and another hand was kept at Evesham by the monks of Evesham Abbey. So his body was dismembered. This was a very unusual act at the time, and it can tell us a lot about what people thought of him and the social military culture of the people responsible for his killing.
Okay, thank you. So that is horribly gruesome. But as you say, there's a lot that we can take out of that. So you've written an article in the English Historical Review, which is called "The Dark Trophies of the Battle of Evesham, the Northumbrian Cult of Simon de Montfort and the War of the Welsh Marches." And that looks at what happened to his bodily parts. But obviously we need to backtrack a little bit. So can you just tell us a little bit about who de Montfort was and why he's been described as the leader of the First English Revolution?
Well, Simon de Montfort was the Earl of Leicester, and he was the first leader of a political movement in English history that sought to overthrow the monarchy in favour of a different system of government. So he was the son and heir to the earldom of Leicester, the son of another famous Simon de Montfort, leader of the Albigensian Crusade, who came to England in the 1230s to claim the family inheritance of the earldom of Leicester, established himself in England as a great magnate, married the king's sister, Eleanor de Montfort, and set himself up as one of the leading noblemen in England. But in 1258, he and a group of other barons and bishops as well seized control of government from King Henry III and set up a council to govern in the name of the king with the help of Parliament. And this was a response to various complaints about Henry III's government, that he was ruling without the consent of his political community. And this was the first time that the English political elite decided to have a go at running government for themselves without the king. The king was still there in the background. He was there in name, but it was the barons and the bishops who were running the kingdom on his behalf. And this was the system set up in 1258. In 1263, the kingdom was overturned by civil war, and two parties contended for control of the kingdom. So that led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and that led by King Henry III. And this broke out in 1263 and degenerated into open warfare across the kingdom. In 1264, Simon de Montfort won a great victory over the king at the Battle of Lewes and took control of the government proper and set up a new constitution for the government of the kingdom. So the kingdom would be run by a council. All decisions would be made by a 2/3 majority of that council of 9, and that council would last indefinitely. And that's the first time we really see such an attempt in English history to just overturn the entire system of monarchy.
And at that battle, after that battle, Henry III and his son Edward were captured. Is that right?
Yes. So the Battle of Lewes in 1264 enabled Simon de Montfort and his party to capture the king, Henry III, his son and heir, the Lord Edward, that's the future Edward I, as well as other members of the royal family. And actually imprisoning these members of the royal family allowed the Montfortians to put in place their new constitution and think about governing indefinitely. And this also created a problem. What do we do with these members of the royal family? There's no plan to execute them or anything like that. Such a thing probably would have been unthinkable, but it also created a big problem for the Montfortian regime, because it means you've got these leading political figures in your power that you have to imprison indefinitely in order to keep your government on track. So the Lord Edward and Henry III in particular become these focal points for potential opposition to the Montfortians.
But they weren't able to imprison the Lord Edward indefinitely, were they? Because he escaped in 1265 and went and joined up with the Earl of Gloucester and some Welsh martial lords, and that led to the Battle of Evesham that we talked about at the top of the conversation. And in that battle, the Royalists win the day, de Montfort's killed, and as you said, the most memorable thing, the thing that I remember quite viscerally from my medieval A-level is the gory stuff that you outlined at the start. So can we get a little bit of a sense about how that battle ran through, a quick summary of how he came to be killed?
Well, Simon de Montfort hadn't intended to fight the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. He was actually trying to escape from this coalition force of the Lord Edward and the Marcher barons, that's the barons of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, and the Earl of Gloucester, because he was outnumbered to an intimidating degree. We don't know exactly to what extent, but he didn't envision that if he met this coalition force in battle, he would be able to win. So he was on the run, trying to exfiltrate his army from the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, get back to his bases of power, either in London or perhaps in Leicester or perhaps in Kenilworth Castle, when he was caught at Evesham by the Lord Edward and the Earl of Gloucester and the Marcher barons. He decided to fight, and I think it's quite likely that he thought, given that he was outnumbered, he was going to be fighting uphill, that he probably thought he was going to die. And we have an eyewitness account of the day of the battle that records him telling his men that they should flee, that they should try and save themselves because there was no hope really of victory in this battle. So they all say in return, no, we're going to fight with you. So Simon, his men, his close allies, his friends, and also a group of Welsh soldiers who are fighting with him go into battle at Evesham. They are quickly surrounded, and they are almost entirely wiped out in the killing ground that is Evesham. It's a very unusual battle for the time because of the extent of the casualties. There is no quarter given. A handful of noblemen on the Montfortian side are taken hostage, but the vast majority of them are killed there on the battlefield. And there is a death squad appointed by the Lord Edward and the Earl of Gloucester, charged explicitly and specifically with killing Simon de Montfort on the battlefield. He's not going to be allowed to escape. So this is a group of 12 men from the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, led by Roger Mortimer, who is one of the leading Anglo-Welsh barons who their sole job on the battlefield is to hunt down Simon and to kill him.
So this was clearly a very definite strategy. And you talked about this being an unusual battle. How unusual was the treatment that was meted out to his body after his death? Because obviously this is the time that we imagine as the time of chivalry, when this sort of thing didn't really happen. So tell us a little bit about just how unusual it was.
It's very unusual in medieval history to see the dismemberment of body parts of the battlefield dead and the taking of the body parts as trophies. But it's also unusual in history more broadly. Now, we have to be a bit careful here because we can fall prey very easily to sort of bias in the way that we think about this kind of act. So it's a form of what psychologists call the availability heuristic. That's when famous examples jump into our minds, and that makes us think that they're common because they're readily available to us. So in medieval history, we might think of, Edward I executed his enemies by hanging, drawing and quartering. Or we might think of famous instances where the heads of traitors are put on spikes on London Bridge. Or we might think of more common examples from history. So we might think of the taking of body parts as trophies, for instance, in the Second World War, where there are lots of examples that people remember of American soldiers, for instance, taking the body parts of fallen Japanese enemies as trophies back home, and think, well, that means it's common. It's not at all. It's just because these are famous examples that jump to our minds. The vast majority of warfare and of the treatment of enemy dead in the wake of battles does not involve the dismemberment of enemy remains. And the same is true in the Middle Ages. So when we think about places like England and France in the 12th and the 13th centuries in particular, these are areas that are governed by the ordinary practice of warfare under the expectations of chivalry. So that means usually that the capture and ransom of noblemen on the battlefield rather than their killing, and it also means the honourable treatment of the enemy dead. Things like the dismemberment of enemy remains, the ill treatment of enemy remains, and the taking of their body parts as trophies only take place in those areas that really aren't governed by the rules of chivalry, but also that have their own socio-military cultures that encourage protagonists to treat the enemy dead in particular ways. So in this case, we're talking about Wales and the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, where English and Welsh warriors have a particular way of operating that encourages them to take enemy body parts as trophies. That's an intrinsic part of military culture in the Anglo-Welsh borderlands and in Wales in the period that we're talking about. And that is what's going on at Evesham. That is what dictates the treatment of Simon's remains. He is being subsumed from this chivalric culture into this dark military culture of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands in Wales, where the dismemberment of the enemy dead is practiced.
Clearly there's quite a specific thing going on here. Were his body parts sort of immediately dispersed far and wide? You mentioned what happened to his head. After the mutilation, were they immediately sent to all corners of the kingdom?
So as far as we can tell, there are recipients that are already in mind when his body is cut up at Evesham, and that means they were sent straight away. So we have to think about who was receiving these trophies as well as who was taking these trophies and how they're carried from the battlefield. So let's take as an example one of Simon's hands. It's taken by one of the Anglo-Welsh marcher barons who is part of that death squad at Evesham. It's cut off on the battlefield. It's given to a courier who takes it back to the Anglo-Welsh borderlands to Cheshire as a present for the wife of the man who took that hand. And we know a little bit about how it was carried. So it was wrapped in a piece of cloth, it was stitched closed, and that package was sent from the battlefield to Cheshire as a present for that wife. The same with the head and testicles, we can assume as well, was carried straight from the battlefield. One hand was rescued from the battlefield by the monks of Evesham Abbey, who were in charge of cleaning up the battlefield mess, essentially, of burying the dead, looking for the dead, retrieving the bodies. And we also know that one of the feet was rescued by one of Simon's men, a man called John de Vesey. He's one of the very few men on the Montfortian side to be taken captive at the Battle of Evesham. He rescues one of Simon's feet because to him it means something different. To him it means the sign of a saintly figure. This is how he sees Simon de Montfort. He keeps it with him and eventually takes it back home to Northumberland. How he kept it whilst he was in captivity, we don't quite know. One might suspect it was perhaps packed in salt or preserved in some way in order to keep it and preserve it in the longer term.
This story of the foot and Vesky allows us to talk about what happens in the Anglo-Scottish borders. So, as your article alludes to, there's a lot of interest in this foot up in the Scottish borders. What's going on there? How does that bit of the story pan out?
Well, it's a very particular, unusual story in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borderlands. And in order to unravel it, we have to think about the history and culture of that area, of Northumbria in particular. And that takes us right back to the days of Bede and St. Oswald in the 7th and 8th centuries. So what happens at the Battle of Evesham is that John de Vesey, Lord of Alnwick in Northumberland, as I said, rescues Simon de Montfort's foot, and he eventually takes it back home. And he gives it as a gift to Alnwick Abbey in Northumberland. He's the patron of Alnwick Abbey, his ancestors are buried there, and he sees that foot as a relic, and he entrusts it to Alnwick Abbey. And they preserve it as a relic, and it very quickly becomes the focus of veneration. It's found to be preserved intact. It doesn't decay. This is seen as a sign of sanctity. The clergy of Alnwick Abbey create a reliquary for it, a silver reliquary in the shape of a foot. And they create a shrine for it at Alnwick, and people come to the shrine seeking healing miracles. And so an entire cult for Simon de Montfort is established in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borders, far away from Evesham, where another element of Simon's cult emerged around the battlefield at Evesham. Now, what was it about Simon de Montfort's foot that created this cult in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borders? And in order to answer that question, we have to think about the history of that region and what it meant to receive one of these battlefield relics in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borders. And I think what's happening there is that this chimes very much with the sense of local identity and history that we see in places like Alnwick Abbey and in Melrose Abbey as well. In this region, they are looking back to the days of St. Bede, the great historian who wrote the history of the English people in the early 8th century, who was describing events in the 7th and early 8th century and describing the life of St. Oswald of Northumbria. Now, St. Oswald of Northumbria was extremely famous in his day as really the great saint and martyr who established Christianity in England, in Northumbria. Northumbria is the great kingdom built in the 7th century that stretches all the way from the Mersey and the Humber in the south right up to the Firth of Forth in the north. It covers the entirety of Middle Britain, and it's where St. Aidan established Lindisfarne, the great holy island, and really cradled Christianity. It's where St. Bede was writing his great history describing the establishment of Christianity. And St. Oswald, as the great founder of that kingdom, really becomes the patron of that movement. St. Oswald was killed in battle. His body parts were taken as trophies by his enemies, and one of those trophies was taken back to Bamber, that is the arm and the hand that was rescued eventually from his enemies, that was seen to be a relic. It was preserved intact. It became an object of veneration. Others of St. Oswald's body parts were also translated into relics. And this was all described by Bede in his great history of England, his ecclesiastical history of the English people. And this is what people were reading in the 12th and 13th century. This was the great bestseller of the 12th and 13th century that everyone was interested in. It's Bede's ecclesiastical history. And particularly if you're living in Northumbria, in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borders, in the 13th century, you're thinking about the history of your region. You're thinking and looking back to the great historian of that previous era. You're reading about St. Oswald. You're reading about the movement of his relics and the reception of his relics in your own backyard. And then what happens then in 1265? You're given the relic that's taken from a battlefield martyr that's almost, it's an echo of St. Oswald's day, and you're thinking, right, this is my chance to write about it. This is my chance. This is the new St. Oswald. Simon de Montfort, the new St. Oswald. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to write his story. And we're going to preserve his cult here at Alnwick and Melrose.
And this interest in Simon up in the Scottish borders ends up with the writing of another book, another surprising tome called, I'm going to get my Latin wrong here, I'm sure, the Opusculum de Nobili Simon de Montfort, which means a little work on the nobleman Simon de Montfort. What's going on? What's that about?
This is an absolutely fascinating, highly unusual tract that was written at Melrose Abbey, perhaps very soon after the Battle of Evesham and after that foot, Simon de Montfort's foot, had been received at Alnwick Abbey. What's really strange about this little tract is that somebody or a little group of people at Melrose Abbey, so this is a house in Scotland today, but which would have been part of the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, which was very friendly with Alnwick Abbey and other abbeys in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borders. Somebody at Melrose decided to set out to trace the history of Simon de Montfort's body parts and almost create little biographies of Simon's hands and his feet in order to describe what happened to them after the Battle of Evesham. And this is the only source that does this. We have other accounts of the Battle of Evesham. We have other sources telling us that Simon was dismembered and that his body parts were taken as trophies. But nobody else thinks, okay, I'm going to write a little story about what happened to Simon de Montfort's hand. And so this writer at Melrose, writing this little work on Simon de Montfort, goes out and interviews people who met Simon, who knew Simon, probably also people who were there at the Battle of Evesham, people who were involved in the aftermath of the Battle of Evesham, and asks them for everything that they know about what happened to Simon's body parts. And he writes these little stories. So he's the one that tells us what happens to Simon's hand that's taken back to Cheshire. And he's got a very particular story about that we can come on to perhaps in a moment. And he also describes what happens to one of Simon's feet. This is given as a ghastly representation of enmity to Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, by the Anglo-Welsh barons after Evesham. And this little tract on Simon de Montfort and his body parts is then circulated amongst a very small group of monasteries and noblemen in the eastern Anglo-Scottish borders as part of that heritage of Northumbria, that connection with Bede and Oswald, because this is exactly what Bede had done in describing the passage of St. Oswald's relics as well. So it wasn't a widely circulated tract, but it was very important to that particular community. And that tract gives us phenomenal insights into this practice of dark trophy making that we just don't get from any other source.
So let's talk about that hand in Cheshire for a second then, shall we? Because you've talked about the cults that grew up around these body parts and the fact that they were being used as relics and had reliquaries made for them. Does that imply that Simon de Montfort was made a saint? And were there any miracles associated with any of these body parts?
So Simon is not officially made a saint. Now, by the time we get to the 13th century, there are two ways of being made a saint by popular acclaim, which just means that lots of people think you're a saint and believe you're a saint, and therefore you are a saint because miracles are attributed to you. But really, there was, by this time, the official way of being made a saint, which was if the Pope agreed that you were saintly and could happily say that your body, your relics had performed miracles. And by the time we get to the late 13th century, the papacy had a very tight hold on the process of saint-making. That involved the Pope sending out investigative teams to interview witnesses, to interview recipients of miracles, and to check, against a checklist, can we be absolutely certain that these are miracles? Can we explain them as miracles? And only if you met all of those checks could you be pronounced a saint. Simon was never going to fall under that category because he was not popular with the Pope. He was not popular with the King of England because he was somebody who had opposed the king, who had swept him out of office, and was therefore never going to be the subject of a big campaign sponsored by the powers that be to be made a saint. He is a saint according to popular acclaim, particularly in Evesham. So a cult springs up at the battlefield of Evesham, sponsored by Evesham Abbey, and hundreds of people in the decades and even centuries that follow visit Evesham seeking healing miracles. And that's where Simon's torso is kept. It's where one of his hands are kept. And so people are seeking miracles there to cure them of ailments. And at Alnwick Abbey as well, a cult grows up, sponsored by Alnwick Abbey, around Simon's foot. So there are various miracles that are recorded in that little tract preserved at Melrose Abbey, describing the healing that takes place at the shrine centred on Simon's foot. Now, when it comes to other body parts, particularly Simon's hand, there are miracles associated with it, but it's very difficult for people to process. So that brings us on to the story of Simon's hand. So the Melrose author gives us a very detailed description of the hand that is sent as a dark trophy to the wife of one of the Marcher barons. It's sent back to her in Cheshire. So it's taken as a trophy from the battlefield by one of the Marchers. He gives it to a courier. The courier takes it back to Cheshire, and he goes looking for the wife who is to receive this hand as a present. He first tries her castle. He doesn't find her there. He's told that she is attending Mass down the road. So he goes into the church whilst Mass is taking place. He goes up to this lady and tries to give her the package, the hand wrapped in cloth. And she says, no, Mass is going on, thank you very much. Later, we'll deal with this later. Go and wait for Mass to be over. So the courier goes back, and he waits during Mass to wait for the opportune moment to give her this present. And during the point of Mass where they get to the elevation of the host, that's the elevation of the Eucharist, the holiest point in Mass, where the priest raises up the Eucharist, and everybody in church raises their hands as this sort of high point of the Mass. Miraculously, the hand of Simon de Montfort that's wrapped in cloth raises itself high above the head of the congregation. I imagine it's sort of floating in the air above the head of the congregation. And everyone is amazed by this miracle. It's a sign of the holiness of this hand. And the lady who's expecting it as a present, she's shocked and she's perturbed and she doesn't know what to do, because she knows that she's been told it's the hand of her enemy, Simon de Montfort. It's the hand of this person who she has learned to hate as this great figure of everything that represents everything that is bad about the Montfortian regime. And here it is performing a miracle, which shows that he's a holy man. So she doesn't know what to do. So she says to the courier, well, I'm not going to take it. I'm not going to accept it. I should be taking it back into my home. It seems to be expected that she should take it home with her and display it and keep it in her house. But she says, no, take it back to my husband instead, and he can deal with it. Take it back straight away now. Now, we don't know what happened to the hand afterwards. And in fact, the author of this tract at Melrose tells us that he doesn't know what happened to this hand. He hopes it went somewhere safe, and he hopes it went to a recipient who was grateful for it and was going to recognise Simon's sanctity. But it's a mystery beyond that, what happened to it.
It's a very confusing story. Before we move on from it, I'd just like to have a little word of the day interlude, because in your article you used the word, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, thaumaturgical. Is that right?
Yes, thaumaturgical, yes.
I've never heard that word before. What does it mean?
So thaumaturgical, this means an object or person who is capable of performing miracles. So it's an object that has powers in and of itself to perform something magical or miraculous or supernatural. So this is what we mean when we talk about relics of saints. So the relic of a saint is usually a piece of their body, it might be a bone, or it might even be an object associated with the saint, with the holy person, that in and of itself can perform miracles. So it might be, for instance, if people go to visit a particular shrine, they're seeking to touch the relic or be close to the relic, because that relic in and of itself has the power to affect a physical change.
So there you go, listeners. There's a good word for you to drop into everyday conversation, thaumaturgical. Right, just moving on, and this follows on from that story about the hand. In your article, you talk about the existence of a dark trophy economy in the Welsh marshes. What do you mean by that?
So when we study these sorts of dark and ghastly acts, we have to look beyond the headlines. So it's easy to be shocked by the process of dismemberment, but we sort of have to instead lean into that and start investigating what went on, which means we have to think about not just the people who were there on the battlefield, but the people who are intended as recipients of these trophies and why they are intended as recipients. What did these acts mean? What did the giving of a present of a body part mean? And this is the dark trophy economy. This is the way that these pieces were circulated and why they were circulated and to whom. And in order to trace that, we have to look at this tract about Simon de Montfort's body, but we also have to look a little bit more broadly at other instances that we can find in the same socio-military culture of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands and in Wales, where we can see the same sort of thing happening, where we can see pieces of people's bodies being taken as trophies and given to others, or we can otherwise see the mistreatment of their remains, and we can start to ask, why did this happen? And one of the themes that emerges is that in the Anglo-Welsh borderlands and in Wales, this is a custom that was particular to that socio-military culture. So the taking of enemy body parts, heads are the most obvious enemy body parts to take, not necessarily because they are particularly special in and of themselves, except the fact that heads contain faces. Faces are easy ways to identify who the person is, so that if you have killed someone in battle and that person is a famous figure, you can send the head home and everybody who receives it and sees it will know that you've killed that person, and that will be the greatest testament to your prowess and to the honour that you are giving to the recipient, that this great figure has been killed. But any body part can be made into a trophy. So a hand or a foot or the testicles also act as these dark trophies that can be carried home and given as tokens, either of enmity, as a way of showing your hatred for somebody, or as a token of love in the case of giving one of these gifts to your spouse. And then it becomes, then this practice relies on the courier who's taking that trophy home to explain to the recipient what is the meaning of this trophy, why are you being given it. So the lady in Cheshire, she's being given a hand, she has to be told, this is the hand of Simon de Montfort, your enemy, so you should be grateful for it. So that's part of that dark trophy economy. But we can also see other practices associated with that. So one of the practices is the distribution of body parts after killing in battle in order to prevent the burial of a hated enemy. And we see this in several other instances in the Anglo-Welsh borderlands. So, for instance, in 1245, there's an English garrison at Daganwy Castle who conduct a raid on Aberconwy Abbey, who are captured by the Welsh, and in front of the garrison of the English castle, the Welsh cut up their bodies and throw the body parts into the river below the castle, so that everybody watching that will see their friends being dismembered and seeing their body parts scattered in running water, knowing that that will prevent the burial of their friends. So it's obviously very important in many cultures, but including in English or Welsh culture in this time, in Christian culture, to be able to bury the dead and to be able to bury the dead intact, so that the dead can rise again on the day of judgment. And so seeing your friends being denied that burial is very traumatic. But this seems to be part of this practice. And again, we can see an example. There's a famous poem called "The Deeds of the Normans in Ireland" that was written in the late 12th century about the English conquest of Ireland, where there is a woman attached to the English army called Alice of Abergavenny, and she is given a number of Irishmen who are enemies of the English forces to execute and to distribute their body parts. So she's given an axe. She kills various of her enemies, and she throws their body parts off a cliff, again, I think, to deny them burial. And this is part, again, of this dark trophy economy, this mistreatment of the enemy dead that is particular to the Anglo-Welsh borderlands. And we can see this as well because Alice of Abergavenny is one of the very, very few people beyond the nobleman name. She's the only woman actually named in the poem, because the author is telling us she is from Abergavenny, she's from the borderlands, and this is part of her culture. So we can see that women are very important in this as well. They have a special role in disposing of the enemy dead after battle.
It's fascinating. This. So we can see what happens to Simon de Montfort's body as part of this multifaceted tradition. But was there something specific about what he had done in the Welsh marches? Was he particularly unpopular for policies he'd been implementing?
I think this is precisely it. Simon was a very divisive figure. We can see from the accounts of the Battle of Evesham, he was someone who people either absolutely loved or absolutely hated. They were either going to follow him into the guns to their death, or they were going to do everything they could to kill him and bring him down. So the death squad that is appointed to kill Simon is made up of barons of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands, the Marcher barons, led by a man called Roger Mortimer. And these men of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands hate Simon perhaps more than anybody. And that's because of a policy that Simon enacted over 1264 and 1265. And it was a policy that involved a military alliance with the Prince of Wales, Llewellyn ap Griffith, and the granting of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands to Llewellyn as Prince of Wales, to the detriment of England and the English state and the Marcher barons. Now, in order to work out why he enacted this policy, we have to think about the threats that Simon de Montfort was facing in the aftermath of the Battle of Lewes. Yes, he'd been able to take the king and his heir captive. Yes, he'd been able to set up a new government, but that didn't mean that his regime was secure. He was facing the invasion of England, threatened in 1264, an invasion mounted by the Queen of England, Eleanor, who was raising an army at the French court. She was trying to bring an invasion to England to recapture the throne for her husband. And in the summer of 1264, Simon was fortuitously spared that invasion, and the Anglo-French fleet was dispersed, but he could expect a renewed attempt in 1265. At the same time, he was threatened by the Anglo-Welsh barons who were intent on putting the king back in power. So he was fighting on two fronts, potentially, the sort of the southeast coast, invasion from France, and on the borderlands with Wales, he was facing a threat there. Now, in that situation, how on earth is his regime going to survive? The only way he could keep his regime on track was to get an ally close at hand, and that ally was Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, Prince of Gwynedd. And Llywelyn had great ambitions of his own. He had ambitions to be Prince of Wales, to be a sort of great overlord or prince who was going to oversee all of the different Welsh territories. And he saw Simon de Montfort as his opportunity to really elevate his status from being Prince of Northwest Wales to being Prince of Wales entire. So Simon and Llywelyn allied with each other against the Anglo-Welsh borderland barons. And they together led attacks over 1264 against those Marcher barons, against Roger Mortimer and his allies. And this in itself was something detestable to the Anglo-Welsh barons. The entire reason that the Anglo-Welsh borderland barons exist is to patrol the Anglo-Welsh marches, the borderlands, to keep this barrier between England and Wales, to defend England against Welsh incursion and to act as a sort of springboard for English attacks on Wales. And they have their own powers, their own laws, their own authority in that territory. So the idea that Simon de Montfort is allying with their enemy, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, is detestable to them. But from their point of view, things get even worse in the months following the Battle of Lewes, because by the time we get to the spring of 1265, the situation looks far more extreme. By this point, in early 1265, Simon de Montfort is getting more and more desperate. He's looking to far more extreme measures to keep his regime on track, to bolster his alliance with Llywelyn, to ward off invasion from France, and he's forced into extreme concessions. So by the time we get to the spring of 1265, when Lord Edward escapes from captivity at Hereford Castle and joins this coalition of Anglo-Welsh Marcher barons, Simon is forced to grant more concessions to Llywelyn in order to get military aid, in order to get men who can fight with him against the borderland barons. And to get these men, he has to not only recognise Llywelyn ap Gruffydd as Prince of Wales, to agree that he can hold that title, but Simon has to agree to actually grant the territories of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands to Llywelyn himself. Now, the problem is that these territories don't belong to Simon de Montfort. They belong to the English state, and they belong to the Anglo-Welsh borderland barons. They are there to preserve the integrity of the English state against Wales. And Simon, in his desperation, says, that borderland territory, we'll give it over to the Welsh. The Welsh can have it. And Llywelyn can take that territory entire. So he's making one of the most significant and devastating offers ever made by this point in history to one of the traditional enemies of the English crown, to dismember the English state, just to serve his regime. And to the Anglo-Welsh borderland barons, that's absolutely detestable. They can't believe this is actually on the table, and they never want it to happen, and they want to wipe out all possibility that this would ever happen again. And that is what Simon de Montfort represents to them. That is, the entire threat, the existential threat to their existence. And that is what is culminating at Evesham, and that is what is culminating in the treatment of Simon de Montfort's body, the hacking up of his body, the seizure of his body parts, sending them back home to their wives. This is why he is so hated by everybody back home in the Anglo-Welsh marches, because of what Simon de Montfort represents. And this is why one of Simon's feet is sent to Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. It's sent as a marker to Llywelyn. How dare you even conceive of this alliance with Simon de Montfort, and how dare you conceive of a possibility of taking our borderlands?
Amazing. So it's all wrapped up in the politics of the time, and Simon de Montfort's efforts to dismember the state lead to his body being dismembered. Okay, that's really, really insightful. Thank you so much. So just to wrap up, you finish your article in the English Historical Review by sort of saying how this episode invites us to think about the First English Revolution within a British rather than an English context. And you probably just pretty much explained it there, but do you want to just try and summarise that point for us to finish the conversation?
Yes, I think it's very easiest to think about Simon de Montfort and his regime as part of an English constitutional story, and I've very much been part of this history in the past as well, where we think of Simon de Montfort's Great Parliament, for instance, that was held in the early months of 1265, which we call the First House of Commons, because it was the first time that not only knights but also men from the towns were elected in their constituencies to be representatives of Parliament, and this is why the 1265 Parliament of Simon de Montfort is sort of seen as the prototype parliament and the origins of English democracy in that rather Whiggish way. And that's a very English and a very Westminster-focused way of viewing this period of history, and that's entirely valid and true in many ways. But also, we can't understand this story unless we understand how Simon's strategy and the repercussions of that strategy played out in different regions. So understanding how Wales came into this story, both as the Welsh as Simon's allies, his political and military allies, and how they impacted the course of his regime, and how the Anglo-Welsh borderland barons viewed this alliance. These are integral parts of understanding this period of history. But we can also say the same about the Anglo-Scottish borderlands and the way that Simon's story was remembered there. Because if we circle back to where we began, and the monasteries of Melrose and Alnwick in the Anglo-Scottish borders, we can think about the profound history and heritage of that region, of the Anglo-Scottish borders, and what it meant to people there to be the heirs of the Venerable Bede and to be writing about St. Oswald, and that connection that they saw between the Montfortian regime and Simon de Montfort and their past in Northumbria and St. Oswald and St. Bede. These are also integral parts of that story, and that makes us think of what we might call the First English Revolution as part of a much broader story of mainland Britain and Ireland as well in this time, but also how all of these different regional histories and cultures played into that story. So the distinctive socio-military culture of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands and of Wales, and the distinctive historic and history-writing culture of the Anglo-Scottish borderlands, these are important too.
Just one more thing before we finish. Presumably, all the body parts that we've been talking about didn't survive the dissolution.
Well, this is, my greatest hope, the greatest treasure one could ever find in historical terms. Would I like to discover a previously undiscovered Magna Carta? Yes, I would. Would I like to track down one of Simon de Montfort's body parts? I think that would be even the greatest prize. So the last written record we have of any of Simon's body parts comes from Alnwick Abbey in 1536, and that's when Henry VIII's officers were touring the monasteries, taking records of all of the relics that were held there. And so Henry VIII's officers record that foot of Simon de Montfort that had been preserved between it being brought back in the aftermath of Evesham right up to 1536, and that's the last we hear of it. So what happened at Alnwick to Simon de Montfort's foot in the wake of the dissolution, we don't know. Was it kept somewhere safe? Was it taken for safekeeping? We don't know. Evesham Abbey, similarly, that's where Simon's torso and one of his hands were kept. We do actually know that only a few years after the Battle of Evesham, the monks of Evesham Abbey moved Simon's torso from the shrine where they'd originally kept it in the centre of their church to somewhere secret, because there was a lot of opposition to Simon de Montfort's cult and they were scared of the repercussions, so they hid it somewhere secret that only they knew. And it's not beyond the realms of possibility that still could be tracked down in Evesham today, but there's no record of where exactly that was. and we don't know what happened to the foot that was sent to Llywelyn or the hand that was sent back to Cheshire. So we don't know, but I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that we might one day find out.
Well, that's a fascinating point to end on. And if anyone in Evesham or Alnwick has a curious box that they don't know about, then feel free to get in touch.